Dr. Henry Wallace had spent 15 years of his life mastering languages that no human had ever spoken before. He could read the flowing scripts of the Zentari traders and speak the clicking consonants of the Morphid engineers with perfect accuracy. His office at the Galactic Research Center was filled with awards and certificates that proved his genius to anyone who cared to look. Kings and presidents called him when they needed someone to speak with aliens. Universities offered him positions that came with salaries most people could only dream about. He was the man everyone turned to when words failed and communication seemed impossible. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Henry was reviewing grammar patterns from a newly discovered species near the outer rim. Admiral Patricia Green appeared on his communication screen with an expression that told him this was not a social visit. She did not waste time with pleasantries. The Galactic Council needed him immediately. A signal had been detected from the Galactic Core, and every linguist who had tried to decode it had failed. Henry felt a small flutter of concern in his chest, but he pushed it away. He had never failed before, and he did not intend to start now. The trip to Europa Station took 6 hours on a military transport ship. Henry spent the time reading through the preliminary reports that Admiral Green had sent to his data tablet. The signal had been detected 3 weeks ago by a deep space probe that humanity had launched into unexplored territory. The transmission was clearly artificial and seemed to be directed at any species that might be listening. It contained patterns that suggested structure and meaning, but every attempt to translate it had produced nothing but confusion and frustration. When Henry arrived at the station, he was taken directly to the analysis chamber where the best equipment in human space waited for his expertise. The room was cold and sterile, with walls covered in screens displaying waveforms and frequency charts. Admiral Green stood beside a young technician who looked like he had not slept in days. The Admiral gestured toward the main display, and the technician activated the recording. The sound that filled the chamber was unlike anything Henry had ever heard. It moved through frequencies that seemed to touch something deep inside his mind. The patterns rose and fell with a rhythm that felt almost musical, but the structure was too complex to be simple music. Henry listened with his eyes closed while his brain automatically began cataloging the sounds into categories he had developed over years of study. He searched for phonemes and morphemes and syntactic structures. He looked for repetition and variation and any hint of grammar that might give him a starting point. 3 hours passed while Henry listened and made notes and listened again. The Admiral brought him coffee and sandwiches that he barely touched. The technician adjusted frequencies and isolated different layers of the signal for separate analysis. Henry's confidence began to crack as the hours stretched on. He had always been able to find at least a foothold in any new language within the first few hours. A repeated sound that might be a greeting. A pattern that suggested questions or commands, something that gave him a way forward. But this signal offered nothing that fit any framework he had ever learned. By the time the sun set over Europa's frozen surface, Henry had to admit something that felt like a physical pain in his chest. He could not decode this message. The realization shocked him more than anything he had experienced in his professional career. He had built his entire identity around being the person who could understand any language. Now he sat in a cold room on a distant moon, staring at waveforms that made no sense and feeling like a fraud. Admiral Green seemed to sense his distress because she sat down beside him and spoke in a gentler tone than he had heard from her before. She told him that the council understood this was difficult. The Velthara were the name they had given to whoever sent this signal, and they had provided coordinates for a meeting in 2 weeks. Humanity needed to respond with something that showed they understood the message. If they failed to do so, they might lose the chance to make contact with a civilization that seemed to have technology far beyond anything humans had achieved. Henry asked for copies of all the data and permission to work from his private research facility. Admiral Green agreed immediately and arranged for a military courier to deliver additional equipment that might help with the analysis. Henry left Europa Station feeling defeated in a way he had never experienced. The transport ship back to Earth seemed to move too slowly. He kept replaying the signal in his mind and searching for any pattern he might have missed. His estate in the Pacific Northwest had been in his family for 3 generations. The main house sat on 200 acres of forest with mountains visible in every direction. Henry had converted the entire West Wing into a research center with equipment that rivaled what most universities could afford. He spent his money on books and computers and recording devices rather than on cars or vacations. His staff kept the property running while he buried himself in work. Claire Martinez had been his head housekeeper for 20 years. She was a quiet woman who seemed to understand that Henry preferred to be left alone when he was working on a difficult problem. She made sure his meals appeared at regular intervals and that his research spaces stayed organized without ever making him feel like she was intruding on his thoughts. Henry barely noticed her most of the time, which he supposed made him a terrible employer. But Claire never complained. On his third night back at the estate, Henry was working late in his main office with the Velthara signal playing on repeat through the speakers. He had listened to it so many times that he could hear it in his dreams. The harmonics seemed to mock him with their complexity. He was making notes about frequency variations when Claire entered with his dinner tray. She moved quietly across the carpet and set the tray on the side table without interrupting his concentration. The signal reached a particularly dense section, where multiple harmonic layers overlapped in ways that hurt Henry's ears. Claire paused with her hand still on the tray. Henry noticed the movement from the corner of his eye. He looked up and saw that Claire was tilting her head as if listening to something familiar. The expression on her face was one of recognition rather than confusion. Henry cleared off one of the large work tables in his office and set up a second computer terminal so Sophie could work beside him. He pulled up all his files on the Cassian fragments, including analysis papers that had been published over the last 30 years. Most of the research was dry and technical, with lots of speculation but very little concrete conclusion. The fragments simply did not provide enough data for traditional linguistic analysis to make much progress. Sophie sat down at the terminal and began reading through the files with a speed that surprised Henry. She made notes on a tablet and occasionally asked him questions about specific technical terms. Henry found himself enjoying the process of explaining concepts to someone who was genuinely interested, rather than just trying to impress him. Sophie had a way of cutting through complicated jargon and asking simple questions that forced him to think about things from new angles. After 2 hours of reading, Sophie pushed back from the terminal and rubbed her eyes. She told Henry that most of the published research was approaching the Cassian fragments from the wrong direction. The linguists who had studied them were trying to force the fragments into frameworks designed for human languages, or the alien languages that humans had already encountered. But the Cassian language seemed to work on completely different principles. Henry asked what principles she thought the Cassian language used. Sophie stood up and walked to the whiteboard that covered one wall of the office. She picked up a marker and began drawing diagrams that showed how she believed the language encoded information. According to her theory, Cassian did not use sequential words the way most languages did. Instead, it layered multiple streams of harmonic information on top of each other. Each layer carried different types of meaning, and a listener needed to process all the layers simultaneously to understand the complete message. Henry watched her draw and felt excitement building in his chest. What Sophie was describing sounded impossible for a human mind to process, but humans had always been good at adapting to communicate with species that thought differently. If the Velthara were using Cassian or something derived from it, then maybe humans could learn to understand it with enough effort. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work that consumed both of them completely. Henry brought out all his professional tools and analytical software. Sophie contributed her intuitive understanding of how the Cassian patterns fit together. They worked from early morning until late at night with only brief breaks for food and rest. Claire delivered meals at regular intervals and quietly cleared away dishes without interrupting their concentration. On the 4th day, they achieved their first breakthrough. Sophie had isolated a sequence near the beginning of the Velthara signal that seemed to repeat with slight variations throughout the message. She thought it might be a kind of identifier or greeting. Henry applied formal analytical techniques to her intuition, and slowly a partial translation emerged. The sequence seemed to mean something like "We speak the ancient words to those who might remember." Henry stared at the translation on his screen and felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. The Velthara were not just trying to communicate. They were testing anyone who received their message. They wanted to see if the receiving species had preserved knowledge of the ancient Cassian language, or could figure out what it was. It was like an entrance exam disguised as a first contact message. Sophie seemed to grasp the implications immediately. She said the Velthara were looking for species that valued learning and history, Species that studied the past even when there was no obvious practical benefit. Species that had the curiosity and humility to try to understand things that were older and stranger than themselves. Henry nodded slowly and realized that humanity's admission to whatever galactic community the Velthara represented might depend entirely on the curiosity of a young woman who studied dead languages in her spare time. The breakthrough energized them both, and they pushed forward with renewed determination. Henry set up a system where they could each work on different sections of the message and then compare their results. Sophie had an instinct for finding patterns that his formal training had never taught him to see. Henry had the technical knowledge to test those patterns and turn them into reliable translation frameworks. Together they made progress that would have been impossible for either of them working alone. By the end of the week, they had translated about 30% of the Velthara message. The content was fascinating and deeply unsettling. The message spoke about observation and judgment. The Velthara had been watching humanity's development for longer than humans had been a spacefaring species. They had been studying human languages and cultures and trying to determine if humans were ready for contact with the wider galactic community. The message also contained warnings about other species in the galaxy. Predatory civilizations that viewed emerging species as resources to exploit, species that would offer friendship and trade agreements that were actually traps. The Velthara seemed to be positioning themselves as protectors or guides, but only for species that proved themselves worthy through understanding their message. Henry felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had always known his work was important, but this was different. If he and Sophie failed to translate the message, then humanity might be left vulnerable to dangers they did not even know existed. If they succeeded, they might open doors to opportunities that could transform human civilization. Sophie seemed less worried about the big picture implications. She worked with a focused intensity that reminded Henry of why he had fallen in love with linguistics in the first place. The pure joy of solving a puzzle and understanding something that had been mysterious. The satisfaction of making connections that no one else had seen. Sophie loved languages for their own sake, and that passion made her better at this work than people who studied languages for career advancement. On the 8th day, Henry received a priority communication from Admiral Green. She wanted an update on his progress, and she was bringing a delegation from the Galactic Council to the estate the next morning. Henry looked at Sophie and saw concern flash across her face. She asked if the Admiral would think they were wasting time with an unconventional approach. Henry told her he would make sure the Admiral understood exactly how crucial her contributions had been. That night, Henry could not sleep. He lay in bed thinking about everything that had happened over the last week. He had started this project expecting to solve the problem through his own expertise and reputation. Instead, he had been humbled by a young woman who should have had no chance of succeeding where he had failed. The experience was teaching him things about himself that were not entirely comfortable. He had become so used to being the expert that he had stopped really listening to other perspectives. Sophie had reminded him that wisdom could come from unexpected places if you were humble enough to recognize it. Henry found himself asking Claire if something was wrong, even though he did not really expect an answer. He was simply making conversation the way employers do with staff they barely know. Claire hesitated in a way that suggested she was about to say something, but thought better of it. Then she spoke softly and told him that the sound reminded her of something her daughter used to hum when she was studying. Henry stopped writing and looked at Claire with real attention for the first time in months. He asked what exactly her daughter had been studying. Claire seemed embarrassed that she had spoken at all. She explained that Sophie collected old recordings from archaeological databases and spent hours listening to ancient music and linguistic samples. It was just a hobby, really. Nothing that someone like Dr. Wallace would find interesting. Claire started to back toward the door as if she wanted to escape from the conversation. Something sparked in Henry's mind like a match being struck in darkness. He had exhausted every conventional approach to the Velthara signal. He had applied everything he learned in 20 years of formal study and 15 years of practical experience. Maybe what he needed was someone who approached languages from a completely different angle. Someone who had not been trained to think inside the same boxes that trapped every other expert. Henry asked Claire how old her daughter was. Claire told him Sophie was 23 and worked at the university library in Seattle, but she was home visiting for a month. Henry could see that Claire was confused about why he was asking these questions. He stood up from his desk and asked if Sophie would be willing to come to the estate and listen to the recording. He tried to keep his voice casual, but he felt a strange urgency building in his chest. Claire looked uncertain, but she agreed to ask her daughter. She left the office quickly, and Henry returned to his desk feeling foolish. He was one of the most respected linguists in human space, and he was pinning his hopes on a library worker who liked to listen to old recordings as a hobby. But desperation made people do strange things, and Henry was definitely desperate. Sophie Martinez arrived at the estate the next morning, driving an old car that looked like it might fall apart at any moment. Henry watched from his office window as she parked near the main entrance and got out. She was small with dark curly hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a plain shirt that had been washed so many times the color had faded. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who lived on a tight budget and did not waste money on things that were not essential. Henry met her at the door and introduced himself, even though she obviously knew who he was. Sophie seemed nervous in the way that people get when they are suddenly thrust into situations far outside their normal experience. Her eyes darted around the entrance hall, taking in the expensive furniture and artwork. Henry led her to his office and offered her a chair across from his desk. He decided not to explain anything about the signal or where it came from. He simply wanted to see what she would hear without any preconceptions influencing her perception. The Velthara transmission played through the office speakers, and Henry watched Sophie carefully. At first, she simply sat and listened with the polite attention of someone who did not want to seem rude. Then something shifted in her expression. Her eyes widened slightly and she leaned forward in her chair. Her entire body language changed from polite tolerance to intense focus. When the recording ended, she sat back and looked at Henry with an expression that mixed confusion and excitement. Sophie asked where he had gotten the recording. Henry told her it was classified information, which was true but not particularly helpful. Then he asked her what she had heard. Sophie bit her lip and seemed to be choosing her words with care. She said it was not exactly recognition, but more like seeing a familiar pattern in an unfamiliar context. Then she asked if Henry had ever studied the Cassian linguistic fragments. Henry felt his pulse quicken, even though he tried to keep his expression neutral. The Cassian fragments were archaeological curiosities that had been discovered in ruins on Mars about 30 years ago. The ruins dated back millions of years and clearly had not been built by humans. Among the debris were several objects that contained what appeared to be writing or linguistic notation, but the samples were too fragmentary and damaged to allow for any real translation. Most linguists considered them interesting, but ultimately useless because there simply was not enough data to work with. Henry told Sophie that he was familiar with the Cassian fragments and asked why she was bringing them up. Sophie's voice gained confidence as she explained what she had heard. The Velthara signal contained structural elements that mirrored Cassian syntax patterns. The way meaning seemed to be embedded in harmonic relationships rather than in sequential sounds. The layering of multiple frequencies that each carried different information. She had spent 3 years analyzing the Cassian fragments as a personal project, and the similarities were too specific to be coincidental. Henry felt like the floor had dropped out from under his feet. The Cassian fragments were millions of years old. The Velthara signal came from an active civilization that was trying to communicate right now. The idea that there could be a connection seemed impossible. But Sophie sat across from him with complete conviction in her eyes, and suddenly Henry found himself wanting to believe her. He asked how an active civilization could be using a language from millions of years ago. Sophie met his gaze and said maybe the Cassians were not extinct. Or maybe someone had found their language and learned it for the same reason Sophie had learned it, because it was beautiful and complex, and worth understanding even if there was no practical use for that knowledge. Henry stood up and walked to his bookshelf, where he kept physical copies of important research papers. He pulled out a thin volume that contained all the published analysis of the Cassian fragments. He handed it to Sophie and asked if she would be willing to stay and help him try to translate the Velthara signal. Sophie looked at the book and then at Henry with an expression of disbelief. She asked if he was serious. Henry told her he had never been more serious about anything in his life. He had 2 weeks to decode a message that could determine humanity's future in the galaxy. Every expert in human space had failed. If Sophie saw something in the signal that no one else could see, then she might be humanity's only hope. Sophie held the book against her chest like it was something precious and said she would do whatever she could to help. The 13th day brought them to the final sections of the Velthara message, and Henry could feel exhaustion settling into his bones. They had been working with minimal sleep for nearly 2 weeks. His eyes hurt from staring at screens and his back ached from sitting in uncomfortable positions for hours at a time. But they were so close to completing the translation that neither he nor Sophie was willing to stop and rest. Sophie had dark circles under her eyes and her hair had escaped from its usual ponytail to hang in messy curls around her face. She lived on coffee and whatever meals Claire brought them. But her focus never wavered. She worked with the intensity of someone who knew they were doing something important and refused to let fatigue interfere with the quality of their output. The final sections of the message contained the most complex linguistic structures they had encountered. Multiple harmonic layers wove together in patterns that required them to track several streams of meaning simultaneously. Henry felt his brain struggling to hold all the information in working memory. But Sophie seemed to have developed an intuitive grasp of how the layers related to each other. She could glance at a waveform and tell him which frequency band carried which type of semantic content. By late afternoon, they had decoded the last complete thought in the transmission. Henry sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. They had done it. The entire Velthara message lay before them, translated into language humans could understand. Now they needed to review it all together and make sure their interpretation was consistent and accurate. They spent the evening reading through the complete translation from beginning to end. The message was simultaneously a greeting and a history lesson and an invitation. The Velthara explained that they belonged to something called the Concord of Ancient Lights, which was an alliance of species that had achieved spacefaring status over 1 million years ago. These ancient civilizations had watched younger species develop and had established protocols for determining which ones were ready for contact. The message revealed that the Cassian language had once been a common tongue designed specifically for communication between different species. It had been created by the founding members of the Concord as a linguistic bridge that could carry meaning across vastly different cognitive architectures. Species that preserved knowledge of Cassian, or that could recognize its patterns, were deemed to have the intellectual sophistication and historical awareness needed for membership in the Concord. The Velthara had been observing humanity for thousands of years. They had watched humans spread across their solar system and begin reaching toward other stars. They had studied human languages and cultures with particular interest in how humans dealt with diversity and change. The decision to contact humanity now came from their assessment that humans had reached a critical threshold of technological and social development. But the message also made clear that the galaxy was not a safe or friendly place. There were predatory species that viewed emerging civilizations as resources to exploit. Some offered trade agreements that were actually mechanisms of economic domination. Others sold technology that created dependencies or contained hidden vulnerabilities. The Concord existed partly to protect younger species from these predators by offering an alternative path into galactic society. Membership in the Concord came with significant benefits. Access to technologies that could solve many of humanity's problems. Protection from hostile species. Knowledge about the history and structure of the galaxy. But membership also came with responsibilities. Concord members were expected to follow certain ethical guidelines and to eventually help protect other emerging species. The most remarkable part of the message was its final section, which spoke directly about humanity's defining characteristics. The Velthara had observed that humans maintained thousands of distinct languages, even when a single language would have been more efficient. Humans studied dead civilizations and preserved ancient knowledge even when it had no practical application. Humans created art and music and literature not because these things helped them survive, but because they found them beautiful and meaningful. The message stated that these qualities marked humanity as a species with the wisdom and humility to learn from others. Species that forgot their past or dismissed the value of diversity tended to be rigid and unable to adapt to the challenges of galactic civilization. Species that preserved knowledge for its own sake had the flexibility and curiosity needed to thrive in a universe full of strange and unexpected discoveries. Henry and Sophie finished reading and looked at each other in silence. The implications were enormous. Humanity's admission to the concord of ancient lights depended on qualities that most people considered impractical or sentimental. The tendency to preserve languages that hardly anyone spoke, the desire to study ruins from extinct civilizations, the refusal to sacrifice cultural diversity for efficiency. Sophie spoke first and said they needed to verify their translation one more time. The stakes were too high to risk any errors. Henry agreed, and they spent another 3 hours reviewing every section and checking their interpretations against the original harmonic data. By the time they finished, it was past midnight, and Claire had left a note saying she had put food in the refrigerator for them. Henry stood up and stretched muscles that had been cramped for too long. He told Sophie they should both get some sleep and start fresh in the morning. Tomorrow they would present the complete translation to Admiral Green and the Galactic Council. Sophie nodded, but she looked worried. She asked Henry if he thought they had gotten it right, if their translation accurately reflected what the Velthara were trying to communicate. Henry considered the question seriously before answering. He told her that translation was always an act of interpretation. No two languages mapped perfectly onto each other. There were always nuances and connotations that got lost or transformed in the process, but he believed they had captured the core meaning of the message. The Velthara wanted to communicate with species that valued learning and diversity and historical awareness. Humanity demonstrated those values every day through people like Sophie, who studied ancient fragments simply because they found them fascinating. Sophie seemed reassured by this answer. She said goodnight and went to her quarters. Henry remained in his office for a while longer, looking at the completed translation on his screen. He thought about how close they had come to failure. If Claire had not mentioned Sophie's interest in old recordings, if Sophie had not recognized the Cassian patterns, if Henry had been too proud to ask for help from someone with no formal credentials, any of those things could have resulted in humanity missing this opportunity. The experience had taught him something important about expertise and wisdom. True expertise meant knowing the limits of your knowledge and being willing to learn from anyone who had something to teach. Wisdom meant recognizing that valuable insights could come from the most unexpected sources. Sophie had no degrees in linguistics and no publications to her name, but she had spent 3 years studying something that fascinated her with no thought of career advancement or practical benefit. That pure love of learning had made her the perfect person to recognize what the Velthara were really looking for. The celebrations continued for days, but Henry found himself thinking about the future rather than the present moment. He had made a promise to Sophie during their work together, and he intended to keep it. The morning after the Velthara accepted humanity's response, Henry called Sophie into his office and told her he wanted to establish a research fellowship in her name. Sophie looked confused at first. She asked what he meant by a fellowship. Henry explained that he would provide full funding for her to pursue advanced studies in linguistics at any university she chose. He would cover tuition and living expenses and provide a stipend for research materials. She could study whatever aspects of language fascinated her without worrying about money or career pressure. Sophie sat down heavily in a chair as if her legs had stopped working. She said she did not understand why he would do that. Henry told her she had demonstrated a talent that deserved to be developed properly. She had solved a problem that defeated every credentialed expert in human space. She had done it through passion and dedication and unconventional thinking. The galaxy needed more people like her, not fewer. But Henry had more to offer than just educational funding. He wanted Sophie to join his research team as a full partner. The Velthara meeting in 3 months was just the beginning. Humanity would need linguists who understood Cassian and who could communicate with the ancient species of the Concord. Henry was the public face, but Sophie was the one who really understood how these languages worked at a deep level. He needed her expertise going forward. Sophie asked if he was serious about making her a partner. She had no degrees and no publications. The academic community would never accept her as his equal. Henry said the academic community had been wrong about the Cassian fragments and wrong about the Velthara signal. Sophie had been right. That was the only credential that mattered as far as he was concerned. If other people had a problem with it, they could take it up with him. Sophie was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. She said she had spent 3 years studying Cassian linguistics because she loved it, not because she thought it would lead anywhere. She had accepted that her fascination with dead languages would always be just a hobby. The idea that it could become her actual career felt like something from a dream. Henry told her it was not a dream. It was real and it was happening. He had already contacted the administrators at 3 major universities to discuss fellowship arrangements. He had filed paperwork with the Galactic Council designating Sophie as his official research partner for all Concord-related linguistic work. All she had to do was say yes. Sophie said yes. Then she started crying again, which seemed to be her default response to overwhelming emotions. Claire came in with coffee and found her daughter sobbing, while Henry patted her shoulder awkwardly. Claire asked what was wrong, and Sophie managed to explain through her tears that Dr. Wallace was offering her a chance to study linguistics properly and work as his research partner. Claire looked at Henry with an expression that contained more gratitude than he felt comfortable receiving. Over the next few days, Henry made good on his promises. He established the Sophie Martinez Research Fellowship with an endowment large enough to support her studies indefinitely. He negotiated with the University of Washington for Sophie to begin graduate studies in their linguistics department, with special provisions that recognized her demonstrated expertise. He set up a secondary research facility on the estate grounds that would serve as headquarters for their Concord communication work. But Sophie insisted on one condition before accepting everything. She wanted her mother to be part of this new venture. Claire had supported her through years of studying things that seemed useless. Claire had never questioned why Sophie spent her free time listening to ancient recordings, or why she filled notebooks with linguistic analysis that no one would ever read. Claire deserved to benefit from the success her daughter had achieved. Henry agreed immediately. He offered Claire a position as head of operations for the expanded research facility. Her salary would triple, and she would have authority over all the administrative and practical matters that kept the facility running. Claire tried to refuse, saying she was just a housekeeper, but Sophie insisted. Henry pointed out that Claire had managed his household and research spaces for 20 years, without a single complaint from him. That kind of competence and reliability was exactly what they needed as their work expanded. Claire finally accepted, and Henry felt good about the arrangement. It seemed right that the Martinez family should benefit together from something they had achieved together. Without Claire mentioning Sophie's interest in the Signal that first night, none of this would have happened. Family support mattered and deserved recognition. The media wanted interviews and appearances, but Henry carefully controlled access to Sophie. He knew how overwhelming sudden fame could be, and he wanted to protect her from the worst of it. He gave several interviews where he made sure to emphasize Sophie's crucial role in the translation. He deflected credit away from himself and toward her every chance he got. Some academics expressed skepticism about Sophie's qualifications. A few published papers questioning whether an untrained amateur could really have accomplished what was being claimed. Henry responded to these criticisms with uncharacteristic bluntness. He released the full technical documentation of their translation methodology and challenged critics to find any flaws in Sophie's analysis. No one could. Dr. Foster became one of Sophie's strongest supporters in the academic community. He published a paper analyzing their translation work and praising Sophie's intuitive grasp of non-sequential linguistic structures. He argued that the field of linguistics had become too narrow and conventional. Sometimes breakthrough insights came from people who approached problems without preconceptions about what was supposed to be possible. 3 weeks after the Velthura acceptance, Admiral Green contacted Henry about the upcoming meeting. The Concord wanted to send a human delegation to their neutral station for formal first contact. The delegation would include diplomats and scientists and cultural representatives, but the core of the delegation needed to be the people who had actually translated the message. Henry and Sophie would be going to meet the Velthara in person. Sophie panicked when she heard this news. She told Henry she could not possibly represent humanity in front of ancient alien civilizations. She was just a library worker who got lucky. Henry reminded her that luck had nothing to do with it. She had spent 3 years developing expertise in a subject that everyone else dismissed. She had recognized patterns that no one else could see. She had demonstrated exactly the qualities the Velthara valued most. There was no one more qualified to represent humanity than her. Henry also reminded Sophie that she would not be alone. He would be there along with a team of diplomats and experts. They would prepare extensively before the meeting. The Velthara were not expecting humans to be perfect. They were expecting humans to be thoughtful and curious and willing to learn. Sophie embodied those qualities better than anyone Henry had ever met. Sophie took a deep breath and agreed to go. Henry could see she was terrified but also excited. This was the opportunity of multiple lifetimes, a chance to meet species that had been exploring the galaxy since before humans existed, a chance to learn about languages and cultures that humanity had never imagined. Despite her fear, Sophie could not resist the pull of that knowledge. Admiral Green arrived exactly on time the next morning with 3 other officials from the Galactic Council. Henry met them at the entrance and led them to his office, where Sophie was already working at her terminal. The Admiral stopped when she saw Sophie and looked at Henry with an expression that demanded explanation. Henry introduced Sophie and briefly outlined her role in the translation effort. The Admiral listened without interrupting, but Henry could see skepticism written all over her face. When he finished speaking, she asked to see their progress. Henry brought up the translations they had completed on the main display screen. The text appeared in both Cassian harmonic notation and in standard English translation. He walked the delegation through their methodology and showed them how Sophie's understanding of Cassian structure had provided the breakthrough they needed. One of the council members was a linguistics specialist named Dr. Alan Foster, who had been part of the original team that tried to decode the Velthera signal. He studied the translations with intense concentration and asked Sophie several technical questions about her approach. Sophie answered clearly and confidently, showing him examples of how specific harmonic patterns corresponded to meaning structures in the Cassian fragments. Dr. Foster looked at Admiral Green and said he believed their approach was sound. The methodology was unconventional, but the results spoke for themselves. He had been unable to see the Cassian connection because he had been too focused on comparing the signal to known alien languages. Sophie's fresh perspective had allowed her to recognize patterns that experts had missed. Admiral Green accepted this assessment with military efficiency. She asked Henry if they could complete the translation in the 8 days remaining, before humanity needed to respond to the Velthera. Henry looked at Sophie before answering. Sophie said she believed they could finish if they maintained their current pace. The grammar structure was becoming clearer with each section they decoded. Then Sophie said there was something the Admiral needed to know. The Velthera message contained warnings about other species in the galaxy, hostile civilizations that preyed on emerging spacefaring cultures. The Velthara were offering humanity protection and guidance, but only if humans proved themselves worthy by understanding the message properly. The Admiral's expression hardened into the look of someone calculating military risks and strategic implications. She asked if failure to translate meant more than just missing an opportunity. Henry confirmed that it could mean leaving humanity vulnerable to threats they did not know how to defend against. The Velthara seemed to represent some kind of alliance of ancient species, and they were testing humanity's wisdom before deciding whether to extend membership. Admiral Green made her decision quickly. She told Sophie that as of this moment, she was designated as a special consultant to the Galactic Council with Level 7 security clearance. Sophie would have access to any resources or equipment she needed. The Admiral would personally inform Claire that Sophie's presence at the estate was now a matter of planetary security. Sophie looked overwhelmed, but she nodded and said she understood. The Admiral turned to Henry and told him the Council was authorizing whatever funding or support he requested. This project was now top priority for Earth's government. If they succeeded in translating the message and securing membership in the Velthara Alliance, it could be the most important diplomatic achievement in human history. After the delegation left, Henry and Sophie sat in silence for several minutes. The weight of official responsibility felt different than the intellectual challenge they had been pursuing. Now the entire human government was watching their progress and waiting for results. Sophie finally broke the silence by saying they should get back to work. They had 8 days and about 70% of the message still to translate. Henry agreed, and they returned to their terminals, but he noticed Sophie seemed more tense than before. He asked if she was feeling the pressure of the situation. Sophie admitted that she was terrified of failing. She was just a library worker who liked old languages. Now she was responsible for something that could affect billions of people. What if she made a mistake in translation that led to humans giving the wrong response? Henry told her something he had learned over many years of high-pressure work. Doubt was part of the process. The moment you stopped questioning yourself was the moment you started making careless mistakes. The fear of failure kept you sharp and careful. What mattered was not eliminating the fear, but learning to work despite it. Sophie seemed to take some comfort from this. She asked Henry if he ever felt like a fraud, like he was just faking his way through situations that were beyond his actual abilities. Henry laughed and said he felt that way more often than she probably imagined. Imposter syndrome was common among people who achieved success in technical fields. The key was recognizing that if you were smart enough to doubt yourself, you were probably smart enough to do the work. They worked through the rest of the day and late into the evening. Claire brought them dinner, and Henry noticed she looked at Sophie with a mixture of pride and concern. He realized Claire must be struggling with conflicting feelings about her daughter's sudden importance. Pride that Sophie's talents were being recognized, but worry about the pressure being placed on such young shoulders. The next several days established a rhythm of intense work punctuated by brief periods of rest. Henry arranged for Sophie to have proper living quarters at the estate, rather than having her drive back and forth to her mother's house. Claire prepared a guest room in the East Wing, and Sophie moved in with a single bag of clothes and her personal tablet filled with linguistic research. Henry found himself enjoying the collaboration more than any project he had worked on in years. Sophie had a way of thinking about problems that challenged his assumptions and forced him to explain things he normally took for granted. Their debates about translation choices were passionate, but never personal. They both cared more about getting the right answer than about being right. On the 12th day, they translated a section that revealed something remarkable about the Velthara's perspective on humanity. The message specifically mentioned human linguistic diversity as evidence of intellectual sophistication. Most spacefaring species had unified under a single language for efficiency. Humans had maintained thousands of different languages and continued to study dead languages that served no practical purpose. The Velthara interpreted this as a sign that humans valued knowledge for its own sake, rather than just for instrumental utility. Sophie read this section out loud, and then looked at Henry with wonder in her eyes. She said the Velthara appreciated humanity for the exact quality that most people thought was impractical: the tendency to preserve and study things simply because they were interesting or beautiful, the refusal to let efficiency eliminate diversity. It was like the universe was rewarding humans for being stubborn about keeping their history alive. Henry felt a strange emotion that he could not quite name, something like vindication mixed with humility. He had spent his career being the practical expert who solved communication problems. Sophie had spent her time studying fragments that most people dismissed as useless curiosities, and it turned out the universe valued her approach more than his. Admiral Green arrived at the estate early the next morning with a full delegation from the Galactic Council. Henry and Sophie had prepared a comprehensive presentation that walked through their translation methodology and displayed the complete message in both its original form and in English. The delegation filled Henry's office, and additional screens were set up so everyone could see the materials clearly. Henry began the presentation by explaining how they had initially struggled to find any foothold in the Velthara signal. He described the breakthrough moment when Sophie recognized patterns that matched the Cassian linguistic fragments. He made sure to emphasize that without Sophie's unconventional background and her years of independent study, this translation would not have been possible. Then Henry turned the presentation over to Sophie. She walked the delegation through the structure of Cassian harmonic language and explained how multiple layers of meaning could be encoded in overlapping frequencies. She showed examples of how specific patterns in the Velthara message corresponded to known elements from the Cassian fragments. Several of the council members asked technical questions, and Sophie answered them with confidence that surprised even Henry. Dr. Foster asked Sophie why no professional linguist had recognized the Cassian connection. Sophie thought about this for a moment before answering. She said that most professional linguists approached new signals by comparing them to languages they already understood. They looked for familiar patterns and structures. But Cassian was so different from any spoken language that it did not fit into those familiar frameworks. Someone needed to approach it from a completely different angle, and sometimes that kind of fresh perspective came more easily to amateurs who had not been trained to think in conventional ways. The delegation reviewed the complete translated message while Henry and Sophie waited nervously. The silence in the room felt heavy with implications. Finally, Admiral Green looked up from her tablet and said, "This was possibly the most important document in human history. If the translation was accurate, then humanity stood on the threshold of joining a galactic civilization millions of years old. One of the council members asked what would happen if they responded incorrectly or if the translation contained errors. Henry admitted that he could not guarantee perfect accuracy. Translation always involved interpretation and some degree of uncertainty, but he believed they had captured the essential meaning of the message. The Velthara were testing humanity's wisdom and intellectual sophistication through the act of translation itself. The fact that humans could decode Cassian patterns was the real message. Admiral Green made her decision with the same efficiency she brought to everything. She accepted the translation and authorized Henry and Sophie to compose humanity's response. The response needed to be written in proper Cassian using the same harmonic structures as the original message. It needed to convey respect for the Velthara and the Concord, while also demonstrating that humans understood the deeper implications of what they were being offered. The council delegation left to brief the government leaders and prepare for what would come next. Henry and Sophie found themselves alone again, facing a new challenge. They needed to create a message in a language that no human had spoken for millions of years, a message that would determine humanity's place in the galaxy for generations to come. Sophie suggested they start by outlining what they wanted to communicate. Henry agreed, and they spent several hours discussing the key points that needed to be included. They wanted to acknowledge the honor of being contacted, express gratitude for the opportunity to join the Concord, demonstrate understanding of the responsibilities that came with membership, and show that humanity valued the same qualities the Velthara had identified in their message. Composing in Cassian turned out to be even more difficult than translating from it. They had to think about how to layer meanings across multiple harmonic frequencies, how to create the right tonal relationships that carried emotional context, how to structure their message so it followed Cassian grammar rules, while still expressing human thoughts and values. They worked through the day and into the night. Claire brought them meals and coffee and looked increasingly worried about how little they were sleeping. But neither Henry nor Sophie could afford to rest when they were so close to completing something this important. They debated every phrase and tested different harmonic combinations until they found ones that felt right. On the 15th day, they completed the response message. It was shorter than the original Velthara transmission, but it contained everything they needed to say. Henry played it through the speakers and listened carefully to make sure all the harmonic layers were properly balanced. The sound was strange and beautiful. Something no human had created before, but something that felt right in a way he could not quite explain. Sophie listened with her eyes closed, and when the message ended, she opened them and smiled. She said it was good. It conveyed respect without being obsequious. It demonstrated understanding without claiming more knowledge than they actually had. It expressed humanity's desire to learn and grow as members of the galactic community. Henry submitted the response to Admiral Green, who forwarded it immediately to the Velthara, using the coordinates they had provided. Then there was nothing to do but wait. The Velthara had said they would respond within hours if humanity answered correctly. Henry and Sophie sat in his office drinking coffee and trying not to think about all the ways their translation might have been wrong. 3 hours later, a new transmission arrived. Henry's hands shook slightly as he activated it. The message was much shorter than the original signal. It played through the speakers with harmonics that sounded pleased and welcoming. Sophie grabbed Henry's arm as they listened, and he could feel her trembling with excitement. When the message ended, they looked at each other, and Sophie said she thought it was an acceptance. Henry agreed, and began translating the new message to confirm. The Velthara acknowledged humanity's response as demonstrating the wisdom and understanding required for Concord membership. They provided coordinates for a formal meeting in 3 months at a neutral station. They looked forward to welcoming humanity into the community of ancient lights. Henry felt something break open in his chest, relief and joy and a kind of awe at what they had accomplished. Sophie was crying and laughing at the same time. Claire appeared in the doorway looking alarmed until Henry told her they had succeeded. Humanity had been accepted into the Concord. Claire hugged her daughter, and Henry found himself being hugged by both of them. News of the success spread through Earth's communication networks within minutes. The Galactic Council released a statement announcing that humanity would be joining the Concord of Ancient Lights. Cities around the world erupted in celebration. People poured into the streets waving flags and singing and shouting with joy. It was the biggest party the human species had ever thrown. The weeks before the Velthera meeting passed in a blur of preparation and training. Sophie moved into permanent quarters at the estate and began intensive study of everything humanity knew about the conquered species. Henry worked with her daily, teaching her diplomatic protocols and helping her prepare for the kinds of questions the Velthera might ask. Claire managed the steady stream of government officials and academic consultants who came to brief the delegation. Henry watched Sophie grow more confident as the departure date approached. She had always been intelligent, but now she was learning to trust her own expertise. She stopped apologizing for her opinions and started speaking with authority about Cassian linguistics and conquered communication protocols. The transformation was remarkable, and Henry felt proud to have played a small part in it. The delegation departed from Earth on a military transport ship designed for deep space travel. Besides Henry and Sophie, there were 12 diplomats and scientists chosen to represent humanity's best. Admiral Green commanded the mission with her usual efficiency. The journey to the neutral station would take 3 weeks even at maximum speed. During the journey, Henry and Sophie continued refining their understanding of Cassian. They had received additional linguistic samples from the Velthera that helped fill in gaps in their knowledge. Sophie developed a training program to teach basic Cassian comprehension to the other delegation members. Not everyone could process the harmonic layers as well as she could, but most people could learn to recognize at least simple concepts. Henry found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just 2 months. He had started this journey as a famous expert who thought he knew everything about his field. He was ending it as someone humbled by how much he still had to learn. Sophie had taught him that expertise was not about credentials or publications. It was about genuine understanding and the willingness to keep questioning your own assumptions. The neutral station appeared on their sensors on the 21st day of travel. It was enormous beyond anything humanity had built, a structure that dwarfed planets made from materials that seemed to shimmer with their own light. The delegation stood at the viewing ports and stared in awe. This was their first real glimpse of what the Concord civilizations could accomplish. Admiral Green received permission to dock at a platform designed for smaller vessels. The delegation prepared to disembark wearing formal uniforms that had been designed specifically for this occasion. Sophie looked terrified and excited in equal measure. Henry stood beside her and said she was ready for this. She had already proven herself by solving the greatest translation challenge humanity had ever faced. Everything else was just conversation. The airlock opened onto a corridor that curved upward in a way that made Henry's inner ear protest. The gravity felt slightly wrong, and the air had a taste he could not identify, but the lighting was calibrated for human vision, and the temperature was comfortable. The Concord had prepared this space specifically for human visitors. At the end of the corridor stood 3 beings unlike anything Henry had ever seen. The Velthera were tall and slender with skin that seemed to shift through different colors. They had forearms and faces that were almost human in their basic arrangement, but utterly alien in the details. The 2 other species with them were even more unusual. One looked like it was made of flowing water held together by force fields. The other resembled a collection of crystalline structures that somehow moved as a unified being. The Velthera representative spoke first, using Cassian harmonics that resonated through the corridor. Sophie listened intently and then responded in the same language. Henry heard her voice layering multiple tones in ways that should not have been possible for human vocal cords, but somehow Sophie managed it. The conversation continued for several minutes while the rest of the delegation stood in respectful silence. Finally, Sophie turned to Admiral Green and translated. The Velthera welcomed humanity to the Concord of ancient lights. They were impressed that humans had preserved enough historical awareness to recognize Cassian linguistic patterns. They looked forward to learning about human languages and cultures while sharing their own knowledge in return. They invited the delegation to tour the station and meet representatives from other conquered species. Over the next 3 days, the human delegation experienced wonders that would have seemed like science fiction just months ago. They met species that communicated through light patterns or chemical signals or direct neural connections. They toured facilities that could manufacture matter from energy or fold space to enable faster-than-light travel. They attended demonstrations of technologies that could terraform planets or harvest energy from stars. But the most important meetings were the conversations between Sophie and the Velthera linguists. They spent hours discussing language structure and communication theory. The Velthara were fascinated by human linguistic diversity and by the fact that humans maintained thousands of different languages, despite having the technology to unify under a single tongue. They saw this diversity as evidence of wisdom. A species that valued different ways of thinking and expressing ideas was a species that could adapt to the challenges of galactic civilization. Sophie explained her own journey into Cassian linguistics, how she had studied the Martian fragments as a hobby, with no expectation that it would ever be useful, how she had fallen in love with the beauty of harmonic language structures. The Velthara responded that this was exactly the attitude they hoped to find, learning for its own sake rather than for instrumental purposes, curiosity about the past and about things that were different from familiar patterns. On the final day of the visit, the Velthara presented humanity with a gift. It was a database containing millions of linguistic samples from species throughout the galaxy, including complete documentation of the Cassian language and its historical development. They told Sophie that this knowledge was now hers to study and share. She had earned it through her dedication and through her willingness to pursue understanding even when others dismissed her interests as impractical. Sophie accepted the gift with tears running down her face. She thanked the Velthara and Cassian and promised that humanity would be worthy of the trust they were placing in human civilization. The Velthara responded that they had no doubts. Any species that produced individuals like Sophie was a species that would thrive in the conquered. The journey back to Earth felt different than the journey out. The delegation was quieter, but not from sadness. They were processing everything they had seen and experienced. Henry spent much of the trip sitting with Sophie reviewing the linguistic database. It contained enough material to keep linguists busy for centuries. Sophie would have her life's work cut out for her. When they arrived back at Earth, they were greeted as heroes. Crowds filled the spaceport and cities around the world held celebrations. The president gave a speech praising Henry and Sophie for their historic achievement. But the attention felt strange to Henry. He had not done anything particularly heroic. He had simply been smart enough to listen when Sophie recognized something he had missed. Back at the estate, Henry and Sophie returned to their research facility and began the real work of integrating humanity into the conquered. They had language databases to study and communication protocols to teach, and a whole civilization to prepare for its new role in galactic society. The work would take years and would involve challenges they could not yet imagine. But Henry no longer felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him alone. He had a partner who understood the work as well as he did, better in some ways. Sophie had taught him that the best solutions often came from unexpected places, that expertise mattered less than curiosity and dedication, that the people society overlooked might be the ones who saved it. Claire brought them coffee late one evening as they worked on translating new Cassian texts. She looked at her daughter with obvious pride, and Henry realized this was the real success story. Not the diplomatic triumph or the technological benefits humanity would gain from conquered membership. The real triumph was that a young woman who loved languages had been given the chance to pursue that love without barriers. The galaxy had rewarded humanity, not for its military strength or technological advancement, but for producing people like Sophie who studied the past because it was beautiful. Henry looked out the window at the stars and thought about all the species out there waiting to be met, all the languages waiting to be learned, all the knowledge waiting to be discovered. For the first time in many years, he felt genuine excitement about the future. Not the excitement of fame or achievement, but the simple joy of knowing there was always something new to learn and someone interesting to learn it from. Sophie noticed him, staring out the window, and asked what he was thinking. Henry smiled and told her he was thinking about how lucky humanity was. Lucky that Claire had noticed the Velthara signal that night. Lucky that Sophie had spent 3 years studying fragments that everyone else dismissed. Lucky that he had been humble enough to ask for help when he needed it. Sophie laughed and said luck had nothing to do with it. Sometimes the universe rewarded curiosity, and that was exactly what had happened here.